Cool. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. My name is Jennifer New, and I'm the Associate Director of the Obermann Center. So presuming that there are a few people who are maybe not familiar with us, the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies is an interdisciplinary research center. We're actually located on Church Street, right across the street from the President's House in an old Tudor house. And we support faculty research. We also have a lot of support for public engagement across campus. And this series, of which today is a part, Obermann Conversations, is one way that we try to make faculty and graduate student research accessible to the greater community by being in conversation with different community leaders and experts. So this is our final Obermann Conversation of the fall semester. And why did we choose election day? These two will give you some great reason. I have to admit it, that probably wasn't terribly thought out when the schedule was made months ago, but I think it ends up being quite relevant to our topic. The first two Obermann Conversations that will occur in the spring semester, the first one is February 15th, and it is Aging in Place, Keeping Older Johnson County Residents in Our Neighborhoods. And that will be a conversation with Susan Chalot and Nancy Hauserman, who are part of a new nonprofit program, Johnson County Trails. And they'll be in conversation with Merce Burns-Klug, who's on the faculty of the School of Social Work. And everybody who's coming in, please just come on in, and there's places right up front. Don't be shy. Come all the way up. So we'd love to have you kind of snake your way through and find your place. And then on March 22nd, we'll have a conversation featuring new collaborations that are occurring at the Johnson County Historic Poor Farm. And that will feature some members of our Obermann Graduate Institute Fellows, actually one of Chuck Connerly's colleagues, Nick Benson from the Office of Outreach and Engagement, and Shanti Sells, who's a local foods coordinator. And those will both be at the Iowa City Public Library. So for today's talk, I just wanted to introduce our two speakers, who first of all, thank you so much for taking time to share so generously your work with us. Connie Mutel's life and passions have focused on the care and restoration of native ecosystems and on educating the public about environmental concerns through her writing and lecturing. She is the author of 15 books, which I was like, wow, that's impressive, most of which deal with Iowa's natural history or environmental problems. An ecologist by training, she is a senior science writer at the University of Iowa's IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering, and she also edited the 2011 state report, Climate Change Impacts on Iowa 2010. As I mentioned already, she has a series of books. Her most recent book was published by the University of Iowa Press this year. It's a beautiful book, and I said I was enjoying it, though it does have some rather grim pieces to it that we will probably get to today. So this book, A Sugar Creek Chronicle, Observing Climate Change from a Midwestern Woodland. Again, what month, when did it come out, Connie?
Just March.
In March, okay. And I will also say it has a beautiful cover by local artist Claudia McGeehee, so it's a really nice book. And Connie and her husband live in rural Iowa City, where they are restoring an oak hickory woodland in its biological diversity. And to our left, Chuck Connerly is the director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning. And Chuck has been a wonderful friend to the Obermann Center. We've worked together on, Chuck co-directed the Obermann Graduate Institute on engagement and the Academy, and last year he was a fellow in residence at the Obermann Center, where he was working on a forthcoming book, Prairie State Sustainability, Iowa's Environmental and Social Justice Challenges. One of Chuck's other noteworthy books is The Most Segregated City, A Study of Civil Rights and City Planning in Birmingham, Alabama, which came out in 2006. He joined the faculty here in 2008. He's the principal founder of the University of Iowa's Initiative for Sustainable Communities, a campus-wide community engaged learning organization. And in the words of their website, we partner faculty, staff, and students with urban and rural communities to complete projects that enhance the sustainability of Iowa's communities while transforming teaching and learning at the university. So these two have known each other for a while and I think have already been in conversation. So it is our delight today to kind of eavesdrop on that ongoing conversation. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Well, thank you. Gosh, with that we can finish right now. I am really honored to be here with Connie. I've started reading Connie's work. I haven't read all 15 books, but I started reading her works going back to the book about the 2008 flood. And I wrote an article about the University of Iowa and the flood, and that was a major reference. And then I started reading, as I began to get interested in this book, I started read Emerald Horizon several years ago, and I've got about 10 pages left in your latest book. But as Jennifer mentioned, this is election day. I think everybody's pretty aware of that. And since we are talking about Iowa and we're talking about climate change, I was wondering if you could give us your take on what this day in particular means in terms of the global picture and climate change.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. Is this resounding okay, or can
you're gonna both have to speak louder?
Yeah.
Both speak louder?
Yeah.
Okay, even with the mic on, maybe we can turn up the mic.
Mike's not picking it up.
It's not picking it up. I'm gonna move.
That's much better. Yes.
That's better.
Much better.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this better?
Yep.
Okay, if it's not, then tell me and I'll hold it.
Chuck, can you say a few words?
Yeah.
Hello, is this better?
Much better.
Oh, good. Yeah, nobody ever told me I wasn't speaking loud enough.
Yeah. So I've been thinking a lot about the election because I really think it is climate change to me is the one central issue in what happens. I think that had we had Al Gore elected many years ago, we would have a different world now, and I don't mean just in terms of humans on the world, I mean we would have a different planet because we would have addressed climate change when it was still manageable. Shortly after he was elected, we went to the point that climate change was essentially a permanent feature on the landscape, at least as far as humans are concerned. When we talk about climate change, we're not talking about getting rid of the planet. The planet's going to survive. We're talking about what's going to happen to human civilization. And I think that this election now is another compendium, not a compendium, but what's the word I'm looking for, Chuck? It's a decision point on what direction, a critical moment on what direction we're going to go in terms of climate change for several reasons. One is that the Paris climate discussions were formalized, you may realize, just last Friday. They were signed into their full power last Friday, which meant that enough countries had signed in that they are now considered to be in full force. That's the official term. And one of the candidates has vowed to take the initiative, which vows, by the way, or pledges to decrease greenhouse gas emissions in the United States by 80% by the year 2050. That's where we have to go. That's where we have to go as a planet, but we've agreed to do that as a country, and then get rid of greenhouse gas emissions totally by the year 2100. And President Obama signed on to that. If Hillary gets elected, she has vowed to take that forward, but also to accelerate it and to go even further, which is what we need to do. And Donald Trump has said that he will do everything that he can to get out of it. So depending on where that goes, I think if we, as the country who's emitted the most greenhouse gas emissions, if we try to get out of taking responsibility for them, what's the rest of the world going to do? What motivation will they have to go further? So that's a major point. The other thing is that President Obama's Clean Power Plan, you may know, is now being held up by the Supreme Court. And the future Supreme Court members are going to be determined by the next president, and that will in turn determine how that Clean Power Plan goes, which is a really major plan. I mean, it's what we've needed for decades in this country. It's an energy plan that pushes the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy.
I'm going to interject. I'm sorry. It's still very echoey, and I know it's a hassle, but if you hold it, I think it's going to be
less echoey. Okay. Good. So yeah, thank you, Chuck. This is better. I think that's a good way, and it is. My husband can tell you that I haven't been sleeping for many nights because of my concerns about what's going to happen about climate change in the election. So,
Okay.
what do you see in terms? I know you have a lot of concerns, and you've done a lot of work on writing, flooding, water quality in Iowa, and I'm wondering if you see implications for that with the elections.
Well, we certainly at the state level and the local level, we see a lot of implications. The state of Iowa has been, I mean, those reports that you worked on, we worked on one report, the impacts of climate change in Iowa, and then there was another one that also came basically out of the Culver administration of the impacts of Iowa on climate change. Those are two wonderful reports. Jerry Schnorr from our faculty, I think, directed or chaired both of those reports. Those reports, and I had a similar experience with the report I worked on relating to smart planning. We turned those reports in 2010 or so, and the minute after they were turned in and the 2010 election took place, all of that stuff was just forgotten about. The committee that Jerry chaired was discontinued. It wasn't renewed. There's no ongoing effort by the state of Iowa to look at climate change as being an issue. Whenever there is an issue that perhaps relates to climate change that comes up, for example, the state's so-called nutrient reduction strategy, which at least does the science part with regard to reducing nitrates and phosphorus in water. There are plenty of opportunities there to make reference to climate change, because some of the things that could be done, like conservation tillage, not only keeps sedimentation down, but keeps carbon in the soil. There's no reference made there. And you have the State Department of DNR, the Department of Natural Resources. This was 3 years ago, and the Congress basically acting as an agnostic with regard to the causes of climate change. Saying, well, we can deal with the effects of whatever's happening, but we can't talk about the causes because nobody understands the causes. Well, we have to talk about the causes. If we're going to do anything about them, we have to identify what those causes are. And Iowa and agriculture, in particular, play a big role in affecting climate change. And so other states like Minnesota are paying attention, but we're just simply not paying attention. So if Iowa goes in the same direction that we fear the U.S. will, some of us fear, obviously, with regard to climate change, it could be, problematic for Iowa's contribution to resolving climate change or even adapting to climate change.
Well, what I think that the world, the average for the U.S. is 10% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. And in Iowa's quite a bit higher. I think 25%.
I think it's 30%.
30% of our state greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. So what are the sources of that?
Well, because we always hear about carbon dioxide, and we certainly have coal-generated power plants in the state of Iowa, and we certainly have automobiles. So we do our fair share of generating carbon dioxide. But we also have methane and nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide is and I don't necessarily, you probably understand the science better than I do, but it's basically a gas that comes off of nitrogen fertilizer. And we apply so much nitrogen fertilizer in this state because corn just seems to love or need nitrogen fertilizer. And so that runs off into the water, and that becomes a gas that goes into the atmosphere. And methane, of course, is related to manure and related to the cows digest food, and so there's a lot of methane produced as well. And both methane and carbon methane. What's going on?
We're going to try this.
All
I'm
right.
so sorry. Forgive
Let
me.
me turn this one off.
Yeah.
I'll let you turn it off. That's on the All right. Yeah. Hello.
Is it turned on?
Yep. Yep.
It's green.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
green. All right.
Good? Better. That was awfully good. So, nitrogen dioxide, right?
Nitrous oxide, and nitrous oxide, and this is better. Nitrous oxide and methane hold, as I understand it, hold more energy, more heat than even carbon dioxide does. So even though they're smaller in number compared to carbon dioxide, they have a lot more of an impact.
Right. There are all sorts of factors that enter in. They're shorter living, but they're more powerful.
Right. Iowa, there's a lot that Iowa could do. I mentioned conservation tillage. If more farmers practice conservation tillage, I'm looking out at farmers now turning the soil this fall. I'm getting upset at them because that releases carbon into the atmosphere. And so Iowa could be a sink. We talk about trees being a carbon sink, but the soil is a carbon sink as well if you don't turn the soil, if you practice no-till farming. So there's a lot that Iowa could do about climate change.
Actually, I don't think this is well known, but Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack started a program this past year called, Carbon Climate Safe Agriculture, something like that. He initiated a program which pushed storing more carbon in the soil through things like reducing tillage and increased cropland set-aside programs and the like. So I think that President Obama has done an awful lot more than people realize in terms of addressing climate change in many ways. I wanted to challenge you a little bit. I've been thinking about this recently, how from my point of view, Iowa has almost been too rich. It's had too many blessings, too many advantages. And I'm thinking in particular about our really rich soils that were developed by prairies over the last 10,000 years. And when I think about environmental problems or environmental challenges, as we like to say, so we can stay positive, environmental challenges that we have to face, I think there are three main ones in the world now. One is population growth, one is loss of biodiversity, and one is climate change. And I was thinking that when the first farmers came here, Chuck, in the 1800s, they started each of those problems. They were governed by each of those problems, which then started to roll forward and multiply in this way. Loss of biodiversity, plowing of the prairies. You got rid of, basically destroyed one of the Earth's major biomes within a single generation. And with that, the diversity of thousands of plants and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other species in the prairies. We lost those because of the plowing of the soil. Second of all, climate change. When my ancestors and others plowed the prairies, there was a tremendous whoosh of carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere because those deep soils that went down 10, and in some places 20 feet, which had pulled the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stored them in the soil, all of those roots, the root masses, were all of a sudden exposed to oxygen. When they were exposed to oxygen, they were oxidized and went into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And then population growth. I don't think that in the 1800s we said we had to feed but we certainly do now. And what does that mean? It means, in my mind, that we've said we need to push our land to its maximum capabilities, no matter what happens to that land, and what happens to our water, what happens to our air, what happens to our biodiversity, what happens to our rural culture. No matter what happens to all of those, we just keep pushing, pushing, pushing because we have to feed the world. Well, obviously, that's a wonderful, generous goal, but there's nothing that exists on this world that doesn't have limits, including our feeding people and more people. You know, we're 7.3 billion now, we're supposed to go up to about 10 billion by 2050. At the same time, we're supposed to be eliminating fewer and fewer and fewer greenhouse gases. And so it seems like we've kind of built ourselves in this state into a situation where we have pathways we're following that are becoming more and more restricted. And I know you've given this some thought in many ways, in many subjects.
Yeah, and it really, it poses a conundrum in terms of how do we go forward. I mean, we are an agricultural state, and we are known for our agriculture. And there is this mantra, we feed the world. One of the contradictions of that statement, though, is that with the advent of ethanol, and this notion that we can somehow reduce greenhouse gases by using ethanol made from corn. How convenient, we grow a lot of corn. We can become an energy state. In 2015, there was in the U.S. and I believe in Iowa as well, more corn was used for ethanol than was used for food. I mean, there is a direct competition going on between energy and food. And so if we're really about the business of feeding the world, then why are we manipulating the system in Washington, D.C. so that privileges ethanol, that requires that ethanol be in our gasoline? There are better fuels for that in terms of reducing greenhouse gases than ethanol. The university has been doing this wonderful experiment with miscanthus. Is that how it's pronounced? Miscanthus, which is a little scary at first because it's a perennial that comes from Europe. And, you know, we've had a bad record. I used to live in the South where we imported kudzu. Teresa knows about kudzu. You know, the idea was to prevent soil erosion. Well, kudzu had no natural enemy and took over everything. Apparently, miscanthus is not quite so problematic. But the miscanthus does a much more efficient job of reducing greenhouse gases than ethanol, and it grows on much more marginal land, and so it doesn't necessarily compete with food production. And so, you know, we need to be thinking more clearly. If we indeed are trying to feed the world, then we ought to do a better job of actually doing that. Now, the other thing, of course, is that even if we're feeding the world, if we're imposing tremendous cost on the world by the way we do agriculture, then that's a problem as well. I mean, economists tell us that anytime we have what's called a negative externality, whereby we impose, by producing something, we impose costs that are borne externally, then we continue to produce because we don't have to bear the cost. And the big impact that nitrates in the water are having, not just on the water quality in Iowa rivers and lakes, in the lakes here, every summer the number of lakes that are closed because of blue-green algae grows. In 2016, it was higher than it had ever been in a year before. And so the blue-green algae problem that affects particularly our lakes related to phosphorus is growing. But of course, the impact of nitrates on the water quality, many people are now, of course, aware of the lawsuit that the Des Moines Water Works has filed against 3 counties in northern Iowa about the nitrates that are being, not just because of the fertilizer, but because of the tile drainage that was put into place in order for farming to exist in north central Iowa. But that sort of fast tracks the nitrates into the water supply. And so the city of Des Moines has purchased some very expensive equipment about 25 years ago to take the nitrates out, and they have to run that equipment more and more, and they're talking about having to buy new equipment. And I've been told that the University of Iowa, I don't know if it's been very public or not, has purchased its own nitrate removal equipment, because the water we drink on campus comes directly out of the Iowa River, and therefore it has not the same kind of nitrates that the Raccoon in the Des Moines River has as well. So that's a major expense. And then the impact that it has on downriver, and particularly the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf hypoxia zone, the dead zone that appears every summer because of eutrophication. And the size of the dead zone is now where there's basically no life that exists at all for a period of time, is a problem that's created by nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, that is roughly the size of the state of Connecticut. It wasn't measured this last summer because the boat needed repair, but it's about 6,000 square miles, as I recall. So these are huge impacts. And so how do we, I guess the question I have for you is, how do we, when I read your book, Emerald Empire, and you basically said we need to, in thinking about how we become a more sustainable state, we have to look back to the prairie. And of course, one solution is simply, I used to say this when I lived in Florida. I said, Florida should just be a national park and everybody should leave. And maybe that should be true with Iowa as well, but people aren't going to leave, and farming, agriculture is still going to be here. How do we combine agriculture and feeding lots of people, if not the world, with being more sustainable in terms of protecting not just the water systems, but our ecosystems in general?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a really good question. I think the frustrating thing for people working on writing about these things, talking about them, living in a university in this little glass bubble, is that you can give solutions, and there are solutions to those problems. Things that we know about that work, but they just aren't being done. It's the same thing with climate change. We know what to do now in terms of decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. We have the technology to do it, but we don't have the political will to do it. And with agriculture, I think there are a lot of things that we know what to do. There's a wonderful program called the STRIPS program at Iowa State University. Have any of you heard of that? A few people? No. Well, this is pretty neat. There is a woman there who's been doing research on taking a farm field, turning 10% of the farm field in strips through cropland back to native prairie plantings. These aren't necessarily really diverse prairies, but they're native plantings that are very deep-rooted, and they're diverse enough to host pollinators and the like. And they found, doing research on this, that by putting 10% of a cropped field into these prairie strips, you can reduce the amount of soil eroding from that field, and these are fields on a slope, by 90%, and you can decrease the nitrogen runoff in that field by 85%. You give up 10% of the land, but what you gain is the idea that you're not losing all your topsoil. We've lost over half of our topsoil in Iowa now. So we don't have a situation where we're going to be able to do this forever. It just isn't going to work. And you would have other things like pollinators. We're losing our pollinators here in Iowa right now. So that's a very good thing to do. The crop set-aside programs, CRP was a hugely important program until recently, until the price of corn went up because of biofuels, but giving more incentives for that. And in the past, there have been programs that have recommended tying the farm bill to ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are the things that people do, or that ecosystems do without any effort from us, right? Like pollinating our fruit trees and making soils, sequestering carbon, producing oxygen. I like to say sometimes when I give talks, what are two things that everybody in the world likes to do? Well, they like to breathe and they like to eat. And those are things that are given to us freely controls the rainfall, it purifies the water, purifies the air, produces oxygen and the like. So there are indeed things that we could do. And again, some of these are being tied together with climate change programs. So it's not impossible, but it takes the willpower. And I don't know where you get the political will. This is the big question, right? Our country is more and more divisive. And I guess if I were to create a vision for the future, what I would say is base a vision on diversity. You know, diversity of plants, diversity of people, diversity of ways that we use the land, diversity of education, all of these things, because we know that with diversity we get resilience and stability. And I think that's what we're losing now, right? With the resilience in the landscape, the ability to bounce back when something negative happens. Do you see that too? Like you've done work with urban planning and the like. I mean, is that...
Well, certainly in terms of flooding, I mean, we've had a lot of, we have and will continue to have our challenge by bouncing back. I mean, the primary way in which you avoid having lots of property damage from floods is to respect the rivers and the river basins and not build in the floodplain. And we were all very happy, I suppose, that Cedar Rapids got through the flooding that took place, the near record flooding. I mean, it was the second biggest flood in history. It still didn't approach 2008 because that was so much bigger. I don't remember the actual number of feet differences. But the amount of effort and expense that was required to do that, I mean, the city was more resilient. The same with the university campus here is more resilient now than it was in 2008 because we have been able to invest in major changes to the university campus. We have walls that go up around certain buildings, like Art Building West has a wall that goes around it now. I think what they used to call the Laser Lab has a wall that goes around it. There are these large green Heskel barriers that were lined up all along the Iowa River in 2013 and 2014 when that was flooding. I hear that it was the same barriers that were used in Cedar Rapids. I just heard that today. So we're loaning them out. So that's nice that we're sharing things. But we haven't really addressed this from a watershed basis. There was some talk, my colleague Lucy Loring has told me this, there was some talk back in 2008, it may have been Liz Christensen that told me this, in 2008 that the university might work out some deals with farmers on the Iowa River further north to restore wetlands in where they had been planting. Of course, at that time, 2008, corn prices were going through the roof, and so they were planting right up to the water, and so the university could pay farmers to restore wetlands, and thereby that would have a greater power to absorb the water. And so there was some discussion about taking a watershed approach to dealing with floods, and that was the spirit as well as of the state of Iowa. But the Rebuild Iowa office, for example, was a big champion of that. And the commission that I was working on, looking at smart planning, was a champion of that. But in 2010, a lot of that was lost. And so what happens is that individual cities or institutions like the University of Iowa that have resources are able to protect themselves. But this doesn't solve the watershed issues. In some ways, it makes it more difficult for communities downstream, because instead of us absorbing the water here in a wetland that surrounds the Iowa River, it still remains panelized and flows downstream. I don't remember what your question was.
Just this question about losing our ability to respond.
So we've increased our ability through engineering and through money to improve our ability to respond. But at the same time, I was just having a conversation at lunch today. The new art museum, where will that go? It will go in but is basically the Iowa River floodplain. I love, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, a couple of paraplanning consultants, and if you're an urban planning student, you've heard of their name, the Olmsted brothers, or their father or stepfather was Frederick Olmsted Sr., the designer of Central Park, came to Iowa City, came to the campus, and they made some recommendations. It's like 1906. And one of those recommendations was, do not build any buildings between Madison Street, which is the street right out here, and the Iowa River. It's okay to have a football stadium, which we had then. It's okay to have a baseball stadium, which we had then. But the rest should basically be a park. And they saw that as being parkland. But the university, because of the constraints that it felt, because it didn't have any land, all this area over here was built up. And so in order to expand, they started going into the floodplain. And then they crossed the river in the 1930s and built in a wetland, in a marsh, basically. That's what was where the arts campus was. And so now the art museum, instead of being over there where it's going to be flooded, it's going to be in a floodplain zone over here. Now they're going to engineer it, just like that new dormitory, 1,000 Elizabeth Catlett dormitory hall. It's going to be engineered so the stories will be up a certain level. But with a greater frequency, due to climate change, of weather events, and you can track the events. There's more rain now in Iowa than there was 100 years ago, and there are more serious rain events. The flood that took place in September in Cedar Rapids, most floods in the past were related to spring melt. Now we're getting storms, in the fall. So I'm not sure we have ecological resilience. We maybe have engineering resilience, but I don't think we've achieved ecological resilience. And we're still fighting nature in that sense. And I think that's the point of your book, is don't try to engineer your way out. Try to use nature on your side rather than going in opposition to it.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of talking about climate change lately because of this new book that came out. And one of the things I try to do is to encourage people, because it's very easy for people to get discouraged and to think we don't have options with climate change. And when I say what encourages me to go forward, what keeps my spirits raised, it's the resilience of nature. But I think that what we have to think, it's kind of like, you can keep punching something, and at some point something breaks, something flips. We don't know when that is with natural systems. We know that we're losing biodiversity, but we know that still, when we do, for example, when I do a burn on our woodland out north of Iowa City, the plant diversity increases, and the vigor of the plants, the flowering of the plants, all of those things respond in such a positive way that it's just kind of like, wow, what message is nature trying to give me? And it's a really positive, reassuring message for me personally. But I think that you're right. I think that humans, a concern of mine is that we had, I think it was 2007, it was the time that more people around the world lived in large cities than lived in rural areas. And I think as we become more isolated in cities away from nature, that we don't have that sensitivity to nature's balances and ecosystem services and the like. So we don't perceive them. If we don't perceive them, if we don't even know they exist, how are we going to protect them? So that's a real big challenge. I think it's one we can meet, but we have to be aware of it, accept it. Maybe that's another thing about this election, to accept the problems that we have and to really agree to work on them together. I mean, wouldn't we all love that to be the outcome of whomever is elected today? That we can work together to restore the natural world.
One of the things that I think about when I think about the future we go into, increasingly I think, and I get this is in your book, but it's in my life as well, is thinking about our grandchildren. And thinking about what, because I think you talk about the fact that your youngest grandchild is could likely be around in the year 2100. It's something that's unimaginable for us. And so That just gives me pause. It's a scary thing. I think before I get too maudlin, I think it's time for Q&A, question and answers. So why don't we ask the audience if they have any questions?
Perfect timing. And let me just say thank you all for coming. We had thought that there might be the front row full, and it's delightful to have such a large group of people here. So, yeah.
Given the realities of our political system and frankly our worsening economics, which I think are just going to keep fracturing in the politics, are folks at the university or at the state level coming up with Plan D on how we're going to cope with the climate change that's coming? I see a lot of work going in inventing, these wonderful blueprints for how to fix things that we have to build power. But I haven't seen many plans for what we're actually going to do given the current reality of politics. Are there folks working on how to help, especially to help the people who are most vulnerable?
Let me ask you a question. There's a lot of discussion about if it should be top-down or bottom-up, and I think that people think that to move things forward rapidly enough, it should be top-down, but the top-down isn't happening. The bottom-up is happening. I mean, the businesses are now pushing, driving, and the economic changes are driving the changes in climate change. The fact that renewable fuels and renewable energy is becoming economically competitive, that's what's pushing climate change forward. Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm trying to figure out, I know Chicago did some studies to look at the homeless folks or people who don't have, they don't have air conditioning. I wonder if there's plans for how we're going to help people to cope, given that we're not likely in the next 5-10 years to, get things changing. If there's real changes already in the works, do you know if there's anyone at the university looking at how we're going to cope with public health or infrastructure?
I think there's certainly, in those reports we talked about earlier, this was discussed, because the heat wave that took place in Chicago that you're talking about, was it 1994, 95 or something like that, that killed 700 or 800 people. Can easily happen here. Whether there's I'm not aware that there's even a plan in place. It would have to be something statewide. An individual city could do it, and I'm not aware that that's been done. But how do we help people? We help people in the wintertime. We provide them with shelter. But what about when the weather gets really hot? But we used to have something in Tallahassee, where I used to live, Tallahassee, Florida, called the cold night shelter. But what you're talking about, if nothing else, is a hot night shelter. And if we have more hot nights like that, it'll have an impact. Interestingly, we have not, the temperature in Iowa is not, the summer maximum temperature has not been rising. In fact, I think it's shrunk a little bit. It's gone down a little bit, maybe, or at least stable, according to, I looked at Gene Tapley's site today, and I thought it had gone down. But it's the nighttime temperatures in the summer that are going up here, and certainly the wintertime temperatures that are going up here, as well as the precipitation. And of course, as the global temperature continues to rise, it certainly seems like it would rise here as well. There are all sorts of possible impacts that the report that Connie worked on talks about in terms of what might happen to people, to agriculture, to our economy. The thing is, after the report was turned in, it went up, there was nothing. There was no follow-up. There's no. You look at the Iowa Department of Natural Resources website and you Google and you type in climate change. It takes you to those reports. Thankfully, they're still up there. But it even mentions that those commissions or committees were disbanded around 2011 or something like that. And there's nothing else. There's just nothing. There's no monitoring at all whatsoever. It's like it never happened. And that is scary. And so this sort of head in the sand kind of thing. What the university is doing with going forward in terms of, at least the university has a lot of air-conditioned buildings. The university is probably better protected than most places are. It's about the other towns and cities that I think are more worrisome.
I wasn't thinking so much what they're doing for themselves. I wonder what the research is doing in terms of serving the community.
Let me take a little bit different step. I think that when you think about climate change, you have to think about two things. One is climate change mitigation, trying to get those greenhouse gas emissions down. And the second is adaptation. You're talking about adaptation. If you admit that we have to adapt, then you admit that climate change is real and that the problem is going to get worse. That it's not just one of nature's cycles. And if you have legislators who say it's one of nature's cycles or something like that, then you can't adapt. So there's not a lot, but sure there are people working. There are people that are concerned about this and thinking about it and working on it. I don't know if it's happening here, but I think that around the world it certainly is. And the big consensus is that the people who have a lot, which are people in this country, will fare a lot better than the people in third world countries. Those countries that have contributed the least are going to suffer the most. So are we thinking about taking care of them right now? I don't think so. I think that Paris Climate Agreement does. It's because it has big amounts of money going to those countries to try to help them adapt to climate change. But I can't get more particular about that.
Thanks.
I think there was a question over here.
Yeah, I usually say the top-down versus bottom-up where change is coming from. To answer your question, the public school system is investing massively in air conditioners. Now you could say that's great, these kids are all from all different levels, they'll have a nice cool day, but are they pushed by the care for the children, or are they pushed by the fact that the parents don't want to keep the kids at home, right? I'm not sure what the lever is. My guess is more selfish than generous, but it is something in the school system. Same with the new one we're going to get at the old water treatment plant, it will have wetland restoration. That's because the FEMA is telling us if you want money, you have to do it. So I think the top is actually sending sometimes the right messages, or maybe not the right messages, but it's happening, right? More than probably what individuals might be doing. I think change is happening at all levels. Some people love butterflies and are putting butterfly gardens, while others say we shall not have apple trees because they're messy, right? At the individual level, and then you have federal agencies that do wonderful work that make us do it wetland, while others are saying, sure, engineer your house and a floodplain you can build. It's all over the map. It's very haphazard, but I'm not sure there's a top-down versus bottom-up story there. I mean, I see good actions at all levels for many different reasons.
I do think thinking about that and thinking about, again, that this is election day, I think that if Hillary is elected and pushes ahead Obama's program and magnifies it, I think that we can see some exciting things happening now. And we are actually seeing exciting things happening in other institutions. One of the things that I'd like to mention, since we're here in Iowa City, is something called the Citizens Climate Lobby. Do any of you know of this, or do any of you belong to it? One person. And this is a way to get a price on carbon, because everybody says if we're going to get a hold of climate change, we have to have a price on carbon. It can come in different ways. It can be a tax on carbon, and what the Citizen Climate Lobby is pushing is something is called a fee and dividend, which is a revenue neutral thing. It's something that we should really be pushing because it can be pushed forward by Democrats and Republicans together. In fact, it has to be pushed by both. It's structured so that it needs to be pushed together by legislators working together, one Democrat and one Republican, becoming sponsors of this at the same time. And the idea is that a tax would be collected from carbon, but that entire tax would then be given back as a dividend to the people, so that the government wouldn't have more money coming back, but the price of burning fossil fuels would increase. And simply increasing the price on fossil fuels would make renewable fuels more economically available. And that would be enough to cause a big flip, to get us off of fossil fuels onto renewable fuels. And there's another study that I read recently that said if we really worked on it, if there were a lot of government programs that were pushing renewable fuels, we could make that switch in a decade. So it's possible. Stanford has a big program called the Solutions Program. You can look it up on the web. That talks about how each state could become carbon neutral by 2050, and it would be through programs that would save people money, create jobs, improve health, improve quality of life, improve environmental amenities. encourage you to, I know there are people that are trying to get Dave Lopset now to become a sponsor of this CCL proposal, the individual proposal. So.
Over here, the Cubs guy.
Oh, this is kind of a big question, but how would you describe the source of climate denial? So, I know there are a lot of different things that would bring about and cause climate denial, but like, what are some reasons that you see, and how can we approach like changing minds? And also, do you know to what extent it's generational? So, I would assume that younger voters would see climate change as being something that's real. So, can you talk on that at all?
Let me start. Okay. I think, to me, I mean, part of it, I mean, I've not talked to very many climate deniers. I mean, we do live in this world now where we don't talk to each other, except to people who agree with us. But, I mean, certainly part of it has to be ideological. That is, climate change implies there has to be some kind of collective action. And if your ideology is built on individualism, and a society basically that is sort of libertarian in orientation, the idea of collective action is against your beliefs. And it implies that there would be a role for government. I mean, collective action doesn't always have to involve government, but often it does. And it could come at a great deal of expense. And so I think there is an ideological component to it. I think as well, there is an economic adjustment issue. I mean, I think this election, not just the president, the election that's taking place right now, but the primary as well, very clearly states that the economic adjustments that have been taking place in the U.S. since the 1970s, in which we've seen more and more industrial jobs first go south and then go overseas, that we haven't done as much as we could do to help people adjust. And I think the same thing is going to be true for people in the fossil fuel, whether it's coal, oil, or natural gas, or whatever. We need to think about how we're going to help them make adjustments. Right now, there is this fear of change, and somebody's telling them that we can go back to the way things used to be. And if you are fearful of change, then you're going to pretend that you don't have to go through it. So that's sort of my take on it.
Yeah, this is something I've been again thinking about just because of that book. And there is a whole field now about climate change communications. That's a major research field. So there are a few guidelines. One is if somebody is a strong climate denier, you don't try to talk to them and leave them alone because you're not going to be able to convince them. And the people that you focus on are kind of this big, broad, middle, in-between state where people are, they're kind of afraid of it, but they want information. If they had information, maybe they would start to think about climate change and what they could do about it. And when you do talk to them, there are a few guidelines. One is you always have to give something positive. I say you can never tell somebody a problem without telling them a solution. So I always try to do what I just did here, which is to say, look at what people are doing. Yeah, it's big, it's scary, it's huge. But there are big, exciting things that are happening. And some people go so far. I know 100 Grannies. Anybody from 100 Grannies here? Somebody...
Plastic bags out of this town.
That is way to go. Yeah. Awesome women. And one of the very active 100 Grannies said to me, this is a really exciting time to be living. Some people say it's upsetting and depressing, but I am like 70 years old, and I should just be sitting and waiting to go to a nursing home right now. And instead of that, I am out demonstrating at Standing Rock and doing other things and really making a positive, what I think is a positive contribution to this world. So there are positive things about living in this time of transition, which is scary. So you stay positive, you tell stories, which my book is basically a book of stories. You explain climate change in very simple terms. You don't use jargon, you don't use technicalities, you don't use numbers, you don't use graphs or charts. You just give very simple explanations. There's a few other things that I can look up if you want, but they're, if you kind of think about talking to a child and trying to convince a child about something, you know, get them to come with you rather than preaching at them, rather than saying, you've got to do this, you've got to, you know, get a different training or Humvee or something like that. That doesn't work. But just kind of leading people more gently do. So there are ways to talk to people, and there are positive things that are happening right now. So
And I
if we
think,
want to talk some more afterwards, I can.
and I think I think one of your points was about millennials. I've not seen any. I don't have any numbers, but millennials strike me as first of all, they have the most to lose because they have the longest to live. And they certainly seem to get, climate change and the importance of climate change. And they also, we'll see how long this plays out, but they have lifestyles that are greener than people my age or even older. They're more likely to live in central cities. They're more likely to take public transportation. They're more likely to ride a bicycle, and all sorts of things like that. So it's
that's a reason to be optimistic.
That is a reason to be optimistic. I'm very optimistic about millennials, and although some say that if and when they ever have children, they'll move to the suburbs. One of the things, and I haven't talked much like an urban planner, but one of the things that holds America back in terms of greenhouse gases is how we've developed as a nation, as a suburban nation since World War II, and as one of your favorite authors, the Thinking Man's Guide to Climate Change, Bob Henson. He says, with 70 years of suburbanization, that's a lot to overcome. And we were chatting just before we got started about electric cars and or whether that would be the solution, or a combination of electric cars plus just people living more closely together so that they could take mass transit or walk or take ride their bicycle. And I think millennials are very open to those ideas, so they give me as much hope as anything that I can think of.
Thank you.
So I planted a lot of native plants in my yard, and I guess my question is, are actions on an individual level like that, do they make any difference as far as promoting diversity and preventing water runoff, or am I just kind of fooling myself?
I think you're doing exactly what people need to do, and people often ask me questions like that. Here we are, one person in a world of 7 billion. Do my actions have meaning? With planting native plants, they do, because I don't know if you've noticed this, but I like to say plant one native plant, then watch it and watch the insects. Have you done that? Have you noticed other insects? I mean, it's incredible. How do they find these things, right? A little plot in the middle of a city, but they do. So yes, you're keeping the native populations alive, not just of those plants, but of the animals that are dependent on those plants, definitely. And I think that if everybody in our city just even planted a small patch, maybe a quarter of their yard into native plants, you would dramatically alter the hydrology of the city. There's no doubt about that. One of the things I like to say about climate change is incremental. It's not on and off. I mean, if we get to tipping points, if we start to melt the Antarctic, then it's on, and we can't turn it off. But at this point, we are still, we think that we're still keeping ahead of those tipping points. And that means that every single one of our actions has a contribution to climate change. It either makes it better or it makes it worse. Every single thing. And so, yeah, your actions, I mean, one person maybe won't make a difference, but 100 grannies will make a difference. People in Johnson County all planting a little prairie plant will make a huge difference, I think. So go for it.
So related to that, you mentioned controlled burns of prairies. So I've got these prairie plants in my yard, and I found this weeder that connects to a propane torch. Is this a bad idea? In my neighborhood, we burning down some of these plants.
Sounds good to me. Just go out and have fun.
So how big is the fire? I mean, is this a controlled fire?
Sure, it's controlled.
Yeah, okay.
Do you have kids?
No.
Invite the neighborhood kids over, they'll love it.
Till they tell their parents about it.
Can you talk to the beauty of budget cuts, as wonderful as they are, because we have budget cuts, we plant more prairies, because then we don't have to mow. And so now as our road signs, it's really easy to make this claim to people who are in denial. So it's not climate change, we're saving money here. And it works. So can you talk about other areas where you may have seen sort of the crisis of budgets actually being good for?
The process of small changes being good.
No, using the rationale that it saves money to do the right thing, even though that's not the reason we do it.
Well, I don't think this is directly related, but my husband and I were out in Boston recently in that area, and driving along roads there, the roads were banked in solar panels. I couldn't believe it. I mean, you know, is this changing? Yeah, this is changing. Now, Massachusetts belongs to this. They have actually a carbon tax there. They belong to this carbon neutrality initiative. But I don't know, Chuck.
Well, you know, where we live in the country, Martha Ann, my wife, notices it more than we do, but they cut the weeds on the side of the roads. They mow the weeds.
A 2-foot swash, just level everything. So
That's for snowmobiles.
it is for snowmobiles. Janine lives down the road. But, you know, the rabbits were hiding there, the bees were getting flowers there. So instead of a 5-foot ditch, we now got a 3-foot ditch.
So they could save a lot of money by just not mowing. It's not just, I mean, it's a combination of native plants, I suppose, and then
Well,
exotics.
was growing, it's gone.
Yeah, right, but it served as habitat.
Including the ditch lilies.
Yeah.
But that's a county issue.
Well, I'd like to interject that a lot of what they're mowing is not native. It's invasive species.
Yeah, yeah.
And also,
But are they replanting with native?
well, there are.
They say they are.
They replant, but I see evidence that they're not doing. They don't have a maintenance plan. All along the turnpike where we live, they replanted that whole strip many years ago, and now it's all reverting to invasives. Not reverting, but it's
Right.
all.
Yeah, you got to maintain it.
Yeah, all the prairie native plants are being overtaken by invasives.
Right. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
I think it might be true that when you have an established natural area, it costs less to maintain it. But it sure as hell costs a lot of money and a lot of work to get it there. We tried doing natural prairie. We own some land in Wisconsin. And it's a lot of time and a lot of money, and it's not easy to do. Even burning costs money.
We have been $3,500 for a couple of acres.
Yeah.
To burn a couple of acres.
My question is more, I'm relatively new to Iowa, but I've been very disappointed in lots of things that I learned about Iowa. But can you refer to past times when there was more unity between, what can one say, Western Iowa and Eastern Iowa, or farmers and urban dwellers? I see a tremendous difference these days. And your initial talk was about possibilities of Clinton versus Trump, but those are all national possibilities. My question, Iowa possibilities.
Take that one.
Oh, thanks. I think I don't think there should be a split, but there is a split. Getting back to the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit, pits an urban area, 500,000 customers of the waterworks versus 3 rural counties. The question is, and in fact I gave a paper last week at a planning conference entitled "Suing a Region to Create a Region." You know, if you want to create a sense of regional cooperation, why would you sue the people in the region? And so on the surface it seems like a bad idea. On the other hand, the reason why they did it was, first of all, to make nothing else was happening. And in the case of water quality and nitrates in the Gulf of Mexico, it's not just the state of Iowa that was doing nothing, but it's the U.S. government, the Environmental Protection Agency, basically doing nothing. There is a Gulf of Mexico, Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico task force. It's been in place since 1998. They publish reports every 2 years. They talk about how they've had to push back their goals. Initially, they were going to have it reduced by 60% or 70%, the size of the Gulf, the dead zone by 2015. Well, that came and went, and now they pushed that goal back to 2035. And when they've been challenged, when they've been told either by the Inspector General at EPA or by lawsuits that they need to do a more proactive job of encouraging states to basically clean up their nutrients and prevent them from flowing into the water and down to the Gulf of Mexico, they say they have the regulatory power to do it. They say no, they don't want to exercise the regulatory power. Instead, they want to operate through persuasion and leveraging existing agencies. It turns out the co-chair of that task force is the same guy who's the Secretary of Agriculture in the state of Iowa, Bill Northey. And Bill Northey and the Iowa Farm Bureau are very, they're very conservative, and they're not rarely interested in water quality. And we passed in 2010, getting back to the 63% of the voters in the state of Iowa adopted a trust fund, created a trust fund that could be used for water quality and purchase of sensitive lands and things like that. And ever since then, the Farm Bureau has fought successfully against funding that trust fund for whatever reason. This sounds, obviously I'm sort of an urbanist, but there needs to be greater cooperation. The farmers and the waterworks could have gotten together and worked this thing out. The thing is, the solution isn't cheap. It's not going to come through voluntary behavior. If you want a farmer to plant cover crops, frankly, there's a debate about this, but it's going to cost some money. Whether you should pay them to plant cover crops, I don't know, but they're probably not going to plant them unless you pay them. And that's going to cost a lot of money. And so we could solve this problem by people coming together. And they didn't. And so the lawsuit is the result of that. I agree, it's a shame. We should be cooperating, not fighting.
Yeah, I would just say, hang in there. Welcome to Iowa. Keep looking for good things, because there's a lot of good things happening. I can't answer the question about the divisiveness. I know a lot of people that have been working, to change politics in Western Iowa, and it's kind of embarrassing a little bit that it hasn't happened, but what else can I say? It's happening everywhere in the country. Where did you come from?
Western Wisconsin.
Western Wisconsin, yeah. Oh, okay.
Which also has its problem.
Yeah, I was good. There's been some issues there as well.
We should probably, it's after 5, so I just want to thank everybody again for coming. It's been really great to have such a large audience and such a live audience. Very nice.
Yeah, and there were people here that actually know us, and they came anyhow. So.